Launched what they called, and the Allies also called, the other Allies called, a second front, by which they meant cross-channel invasion that was eventually D-Day. Please launch a second front, because that will draw away enormous numbers of German troops away from where we are and may help us survive as a nation. Churchill's very, very careful to say when Molotov turns up, well, we'll see what we can do, we can't promise anything. When you go to see Roosevelt, Roosevelt in the meeting seems to lead Molotov to believe that it can happen in 1942. And Stalin looks at that and Molotov looks at that and they go, these people are actually going to help us. And then by the summer, it's clear there's going to be no second front in 1942. That's the reason Churchill visits Stalin in August 42. Stalin is deeply angry, feels betrayed. Churchill says, we can't launch a second front in 1942. But then he says, don't worry, and I'm paraphrasing him, don't worry, because if we launched it hastily now in 42, it would interfere with what will be a major operation for 1943. And Stalin writes to them at the end of the year and said, when exactly? And originally they'd said spring, and Churchill has to write back and go, can't really be spring 43, autumn. Stay prepared, autumn. And then by May, Churchill and Roosevelt have to let Stalin know, spring 44 actually. Well, we in the West have not the remotest idea, most people, of the enormity of the sense of betrayal that creates inside the Soviet Union and with Stalin. The absolute sense many of these people have is that this is a deliberate lie in order that Soviet soldiers keep dying by their thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, while the West sits back and lets them bleed each other dry. And imagine how all this plays to a person who is naturally suspicious to the point of paranoia. Stalin's view then is, well, the only reason they launched D-Day in 44 was because they saw how far west we were coming, so it was to stop us getting France. I've never written a book and then thought, oh, this should be televised. I've never made a television series and thought this should be a book. All of these series, the two go absolutely hand in hand. There was a very great historian who said that ultimately the only goal is understanding, and the great, immense satisfaction of never quite reaching understanding, because in this area, which is why I keep also coming back to the Nazis, ultimately to me the Nazis, I have to say, have a level of depth of inscrutability that's different from the Soviets. But you keep going and going and going and finding more and more and finding little answers on the way, but certain huge questions always remain slightly ahead of you and out of your grasp. You know, why do people do things? Why do people do what we think are very bad things and don't feel bad about it? Really very straightforward questions about what it is to be human. What's the point? How do people in their lives have any sense of purpose? How important is it to people to feel that they're belonging to something so much bigger than themselves? How does that deal with them? How do people lay down their lives for something else, lay down their lives for their friends or an ideal? These are huge sort of epic questions that for me, I choose to try and get at through this. And when you're dealing with the Second World War, you're dealing with the biggest, most important, most brutal conflict in the history of the world. And when you're dealing with the Nazis or the Soviets, you're dealing with two of the most extraordinary tyrannical regimes in the history of the world, and very different regimes. When you're dealing with Auschwitz, you're dealing with the physical site of the largest mass murder in the history of the world. Why, you know, I look at people who don't want to try and understand how and why Auschwitz happens as they're the weird ones. There's a huge change in the way I approach this from Horror Nice to the Auschwitz series, because with those other ones there was absolutely no drama in it. There was very limited use of electronic graphic material, and then with Auschwitz really the breakthrough was, I hope, successfully using drama based on absolutely accurate archival sources, and it was that made me then think, well, can we take this a step further and use that with this series? There's no way of doing it without dramatization. What I wanted to do, impossible. So it's very straightforward. You either embrace this way forward with all of its concerns and limitations and so on, or you don't do it. That was certainly, and that was something I learned with the Auschwitz series. And what we were trying to do with the Auschwitz series was something very, very different than had been done before, which was to look at the narrative arc through the series being the decision-making process of the Nazis as to how they arrived at this. That was the most secret thing, one of the most secret things in the Reich. There was no possibility of any archive of this. People were sufficient, the actual people involved were all dead. But to try and think of recreating that as far as we possibly could imagine it happening from documents, from other eyewitness testimony and so on, was the only way we could do it. And absolutely with this is the only way we can do it. It's still different from making a drama out of it. I want to use drama techniques as a way of trying to show what might have happened. But a lot of people who get involved in this see drama in some way as, well, if this is part of my show reel, if this maybe I can go on to do something else. And then they start employing screenwriters. And as soon as you employ a screenwriter and say, here's the material, craft it, stay as close as you can, it's gone. It's gone, because the point of drama is to make meaning in a narrative arc out of something that can often be, if not meaningless, have a very bad message in it. Was Oscar Wilde, the good end happily and the bad unhappily, that's why we know it's fiction. What interests me is the fact that these stories, very often very good people, terrible things happen to. The bad people sometimes win. Sometimes you see arbitrariness of things that, you can't write a script. Macbeth is fighting, Macbeth becomes King of Scotland, and then he has a heart attack halfway through Act 3 and dies. There's no play. But that happens all the time in real history. So it was important. There's no screenwriter. We're trying to do something that's different. The problem is that the methodology you're using is the same at one level as the other methodology. So unless you're careful, there's a grammatical confusion in it as to what this thing is. I wrote and produced the series. I directed the documentary, and I asked Andrew Williams to direct the drama sequences, and then I sat in an edit for a year and a bit and cut everything and wrote the final commentary to it. And anything in terms of the drama that I wasn't happy with, I simply cut out and didn't use. So I have to take complete responsibility for it. My whole way of looking at the world has changed as a result of being allowed what I think is an immense privilege, which is actually meeting and being able to question and film these people. And that's because there's just the most incredible difference between being able to meet someone who worked with Hitler and say, well, come on, surely you can actually have a dialogue. You can say, well, you can't really be like that, tell me. And they can talk and argue with you about it. And of course you have to be, as all proper historians are, very, very wary of people talking so long after the event and so on. But nonetheless, I remain of the view that it's just immensely valuable. I met a historian at Oxford his speciality was the Napoleonic period, and he said, oh, it's just the worst thing. He said, the most terrible thing for me is no matter how much I read this stuff, no matter how much I imagine it, ultimately I don't know that I can ever get close to knowing what it was like. Well, imagine if we had uncovered somewhere a half-hour interview with Napoleon, recorded by some magical new technique in 1800, in which he's being asked these sorts of questions and it's talking about, well, just half an hour would transform how we think about Napoleon. Because the personal qualities of charisma and various other things that a lot of these people are alleged to have, not Stalin, but certainly Churchill, you can only begin to emotionally grasp these things, ultimately, really, if there they are in front of you. So in the period I've chosen to look at, have not just the newsreel material. I have film of Hitler's speeches. I can see, trying to understand how on earth is this happening, and less but still good material on Stalin. But I can meet people who were in it. I can say, well, what was it like then? And it's just fantastic.